Understanding and using layers like a pro. In this lecture, you'll learn what layers are, how to use them like a professional, and how you can speed up your workflow with certain hotkeys and key concepts. I'll use Photoshop CC, but all these bits apply in CS6 too. First, you can think of layers like transparent pieces of paper that stack on top of each other. Their purpose is to give you freedom by isolating certain areas or elements onto separate sheets. This allows you to work without worrying that you might mess up some of your other components. Let's look at an example. Here we have an orange I designed for my blog. It's also attached to this lecture. If we look at the canvas, so this area here, you might think of it as a painting on a piece of paper. But if we look at our Layers panel, we'll see it's made up from several layers. To further illustrate the point, we can switch tabs and look at this composition. Here I've added all these transparent rectangles, and we're looking at the orange project from the side. This shows us that when you stack them all together, you get what you see in the first tab. But what's going on is a layering effect, where you stack several transparent sheets on top of each other, and each individual piece contains one component. So we have a sheet, or a layer, for the shadow, one for the body of the orange, one for its leaf, one for the background, and so on. And when you select one layer, you can imagine all the rest disappear and you're only affecting it, not the rest. That's how layers work. You might ask yourself, why the trouble? Well, going back to our first tab, we can now select the background layer, get a random brush and paint. Notice that even though I'm trying to paint over the orange, nothing happens to it. And that's because it's on a separate layer. This allows me to do all sorts of crazy adjustments to my background without fearing I'll destroy my beautiful orange. If I want to adjust the leaf, I can select it from the Layers panel and get to work. So that's the concept of layers, and that's their main benefit. Now, let's see how you can work with layers like a pro. First, if you want to identify an existing layer in a project, I suggest one of these options. 1. Toggle its visibility. You can do that by clicking on this eye icon on the left of its thumbnail. You can do that with one layer, or you can hold down your mouse click and quickly move up or down. As you can see, by doing this with one layer at a time, I can identify its purpose on the canvas. If you see no difference by hiding it, you can use option 2, click on its thumbnail, while holding down the Control or Command key. We can try that on the highlight layer. If we hide it, you may see no big change in our composition. The difference is very subtle. But now I'll hold the Control key and click on its thumbnail, and immediately we can see it. You've just made a selection, but we'll talk about that later on. Remember to hold down the Control key while you click on the thumbnail, and you need to use Control D to deselect to continue working. This second method isn't bulletproof though. If you try this method on layers with few pixels, you'll get the following warning. But these two options should help you identify pre-existing layers. Another tip I can give you is to keep your thumbnail size small. If you right-click on this region, you'll get a bunch of options. But what interests us is this group here. By using large thumbnails, you're more likely to recognize layers quickly. But the downside is you're wasting precious space. Your projects won't have 5 to 10 layers. They'll most likely have tens, if not hundreds. It's best to keep them compact. If you want to rename a layer, you can double-click on its existing name and you can change it. It doesn't matter what type of characters you use or if there's another layer with the same name. You have complete freedom. But I recommend you always name them in a way that describes them accurately. Here I have body shadow, but I also have leaf shadow. If I used just shadow for both, it would have been confusing. If you double-click to the side of their name, you'll get this window to show up. That only happens if you miss the layer name. Just press Escape and double-click again. Having a well-organized layers panel is essential for any project, and besides all these tips, you can also group layers by using folders. Think of it like in your operating system. You have files, but you don't scatter them all around your drive. Instead, you group them based on the program they belong to. Here, for example, the leaf component has several layers to group together. I'll select them in the Layers panel by holding down the Control or Command key. This is how you select multiple layers at once. To make sure I've selected the right ones, I have a very simple yet effective tip. Just move them onto the canvas. Then press Ctrl Z to undo. If it's not right, select or deselect additional layers and repeat the process. To create a group after you've selected them in the Layers panel, you need to use Ctrl-G. This does two things in one action. It creates a new folder, but it also moves those selected layers into it. This is called Group 1 by default, but renaming it is easy. Just double-click it and write something descriptive like full leaf. One important thing you have to know is when to create a new layer or folder. These decisions are up to you, but here are my pointers. First, don't create folders for one or two layers. It really makes little sense as these groups aim to clean up your Layers panel, not add more clutter. Also, you're free to create groups within groups. You can go as deep as you'd like, but I recommend you stick to 3 levels. So let me show you a quick example. We already have a group for our leaf, but we can group all the other layers into one big folder and call it Orange 1. Now I'll duplicate it, and in total we'll have 3. I'll position them exactly as I want on my canvas. Now I'll group yet again because I want to move them as a whole to keep this arrangement. And there you go, we now have a folder that contains 3 folders and each has another folder inside. How do you ungroup your layers? Easy, just right-click it in the Layers panel and select Ungroup Layers. Now that folder has disappeared, but it doesn't delete its contents. Instead, it brings them out. So those are groups briefly. We'll use them a lot in our project, so you'll get used to them. Regarding layers, you can create a new one by clicking on this icon here. By default, it will be empty, meaning it will be transparent. Regarding how many you should use, I'd say it's very tricky. On one hand, it might be best to have more layers because you get more freedom and you can always combine them into fewer ones. The other side of the coin is that more layers means a messier Layers panel. It's harder to keep a track of them, and most users forget to rename them. I recommend you watch the rest of my course and see my approach, and based on that, you can determine my thought process based on various particular circumstances. One last but very important concept you have to understand is that layers stack in the order you put them in your Layers panel. In our document, the BG layer is the last one. If we move it onto the top by clicking and holding, you'll notice we see nothing else. And that's because this is not a transparent layer. It's filled with colour. So if you put it above all other layers, nothing else can be seen. So always be aware of the order of your layers. And that wraps up this lecture. I know we went through a lot of information, but soon we'll jump into our first exercise and you'll see how quickly you pick up all these new bits of info. Let's get to it.